Let's delete all figures. We'll create them again, but before we do that, let's talk about some more Corel rules. Let's draw a triangle. To do that, select the polygon tool and draw a polygon and change the number of its corners to 3. Every new object drawn with the polygon tool will have 5 corners. To change that, follow these steps. First, make sure that there's nothing selected. Now, click on the polygon tool. Change the amount of corners to 3. Now, every new figure created by the polygon tool will have 3 corners. In other words, now the polygon tool will always make a triangle. We already know that if we click twice on a triangle, a rotation point will appear. We can change the X and Y axis of the rotation point right here in the Transformations docker. The rotation of the figure or figures is defined by the position of the rotation point, the transformation point. This is a little circle with a dot in it. Again, we can change its position with these values right here. Let's change copies to 1 and click apply several times. As you can see, the figures are rotating around the transformation point. Let's downscale our figure a little. Let's now talk about this strange net and relative center option. For now, we leave the relative center option deactivated. These little squares indicate the position of the rotation center on our figure. The rotation point will change its position when we click on one of these squares. We can say that using this option can change its position where the transformation handles are now. If we click on the top left square, the rotation point will move to the top of our figure. When we click apply, the figures will appear around the current position of the rotation point. So this net gives us a choice of where we want to place the rotation point. It's important to know that because other programs may not have an option to define the X and Y axis this way. This option allows us to move the rotation point where we want. If we put 45 here, it will move like this. Let's now activate the relative center option. Well, maybe let's talk about how the figure reacts when this option isn't active. When it's deactivated, the X position is determined by the document accent. So, it starts right here in the bottom left-hand corner of the document, where there's 0 on the left-hand ruler. Let's test this. Change the X and Y axis to 0. As you can see, the rotation point was moved to the very beginning of the axis, in this case, the bottom left corner of the document. When we change the X and Y axis to 0, the rotation point was moved to the very beginning of the axis. When the relative option is deactivated, the X and Y are measured from the bottom left-hand corner of the document. We can move the beginning of the axis. To do that, click on part where the tool rulers meet together. Hold the mouse button and position the beginning of the axis. As you can see, the 0 point moves somewhere here. If we change the axis by mistake, we can reset its position by clicking on this icon twice. For now, let's not change the 0 point of our axis. Let's now activate. So, if the relative center option is deactivated, the placement of the rotation point is measured from the beginning of the axis, or, in other words, the bottom left-hand corner of the document. Let's activate the relative centre option and set X and Y to 0 mil. Press Enter to duplicate and rotate the figure. Well, let's change the X-axis to 7 and see what will happen. As you can see, when the relative centre option is active, the rotation point position will be measured from the centre of the figure. So if we now change the Y-axis to 23, the rotation point will go up by 23 mil from the centre of the figure. The centre of the figure is where the little x is. It's a point created by two diagonal lines coming from the corner transformation handles. So, now we know how to use and what the usage is of this grid and the relative centre option. Again, the relative centre option will measure the position of the axis starting from the centre of the figure. Let's now repeat what we've done in the last part of the course. Draw a proportional circle and lock the proportions by clicking the lock on the controls bar. Change the width of the circle to 60 mm. Switch to Polygon tool and create a triangle. Select the circle. Change the circle's X position to 80 and Y position to 170. Now, select the triangle and change only the X position to 80. What does it mean that both figures have the same X value? It means they are vertically aligned. So, when we set the same X value for both the circle and the triangle, they will automatically be aligned vertically. We can do the same thing by selecting two figures at once and clicking on Align and Distribute. In the appearing window, there's an option to align figures vertically. To align figures, click on the Align Center Horizontally icon in the Align section of the Align and Distribute window. Once we click it, the figures will be aligned and the program will show the alignment line. In other words, the figures are aligned with the X-axis. Let's close the Align and Distribute window. As you can see, these dockers are now grouped together. Here's one tab and here's the other. Let's close only the Align and Distribution part. Now, dock the transformation docker on the left-hand side of the screen. We need to have some practice to learn how to use these dockers. Let's go back to our task. We know the X of both figures and the Y of the circle. Select the triangle, set the rotation angle to 30 degrees. Set the Y-axis to 170 and copies to 1. Now click the Apply button. Your figure should now look the same as mine. Select the bottom three triangles and delete them. Now, select all the figures. Hold Ctrl and move the figures vertically up. Now, let's draw a rectangle. Please notice that our rectangle is not yet converted to curves. If it was, the Convert to Curves option wouldn't be active. So when our rectangle is still a normal figure, we can make its corners round. The lock next to the values is active, so when we change one value, the other will change as well. Change the first value to 5 mm. As you can see, the corners are now round. We can also change the type of our figure's corners by clicking these icons here. There are three options to choose from: round corner, scallop corner and chamfered corner. We can also do that in a different way. Let's say that we don't like changing the values and we want to do it with our mouse. Switch the corner roundness back to 0 and choose the Shape tool. Let's go back and analyse this situation. Before we selected the Shape tools, our rectangle was already selected. When we switched to Shape tool, 4 nodes appeared in each corner of the rectangle. Click on one of these nodes, hold the mouse button and move it. All nodes will move, creating nice round corners. When we click on the node for the second time, all other nodes will be deselected. Now we can modify the shape of one corner at a time. So, to edit just one node, click on it twice. To select all nodes again, click twice on the currently active node. Well, we won't really be using this technique. Most of the time we'll edit the shape corners by changing these values right here. If we deactivate the lock, we can change the value of each corner individually. If the lock is active, all corners will change automatically. Now press F3 to zoom out. Let's now talk about how we can align our new figure with the previously created circle. We can set its X position the same as the circle position, 80 mm. But we may not want to check the X position each time we want to align the figures. In this case, there's another way to align the two figures. When we previously talked about selecting figures, we said that when we select a couple of figures, the decisive one is the one on the very bottom. Select the rectangle and hold Shift and select the circle. Now, activate the Align and Distribute palette. Maybe let's choose the Transformations palette. The top of the Align and Distribute window has two sections, Align and Distribute. For now, we'll only be interested in the Align section. Click on the Align Center horizontally icon. As you can see, the rectangle was aligned with the circle. Now, let's first select the circle. Hold the Shift and select the rectangle. What will happen if the rectangle is the last selected figure? Once we click the Align icon, the circle will change its position. It will be aligned with the position of the rectangle. So the order in which we select the figures takes a decisive part in the progress of alignment. In other words, the first selected figure will be the one which will change its position in the process of alignment. Let's now try the same process with two figures selected by a selection box. Now, the top object will be aligned with the bottom object. In our case, the circle will stay the same place and the rectangle will move. When we have more objects, all objects will be aligned with the one placed at the very bottom. When we select with Shift, the object that is selected last is the one that the other object is aligned to. Now, hold Ctrl and move the rectangle up. Another useful option which we can use in this task is Snap to Objects. To activate it, go to the View menu, then Snap to, and click on Snap to Objects. Let's see what will happen. First, let's duplicate our rectangle. Click on it, hold the left mouse button and move it, and click the right mouse button while still holding the left mouse button. Now, move your mouse over the node and wait for the Smart Guide to appear. When the crosshair will appear, drag the rectangle to another figure. As you can see, the snap option snapped the node to the node in the next figure. Now, let's try the same thing, but with the edge of our figure. So, Snap to Objects is a very useful tool that helps us position figures correctly. Select the figures, move them, and click the right mouse button to duplicate them. We can also use the option, which is new for this version of CorelDraw, alignment guides. This is a very interesting option. To see how it works, let's change one of the guideline options. To see the guidelines better, let's change their colour. To do that, go to the View menu, then Preferences, and click on Alignment Guide Setup. Here we can choose the colour of our guides. Let's choose red. Now, that the guidelines will be red, we can see them better on our screen. As you can see, when we move our figure, red guidelines appear which help us position our figure. So, alignment guides are just another useful thing which we can use during our work with CorelDraw. So, click on the icon, drag it down, don't release the left mouse button and click the right mouse button. When we duplicate our figures this way, we can position them at the same time. All it takes to do that is just to look at the guideline on the side or the one in the center. So now we know how to activate and deactivate alignment guides. Press F3 to zoom out. Select our light bulb. Well, maybe edit corners of the rectangle so it'll look a bit better. Let's set this value to 15 and hit enter. Activate Snap to Objects option and quickly duplicate the figures. Select the whole light bulb. Now, deactivate the Snap to Objects option. Remember that we're multiplying figures with our mouse. To do that, we drag the figure with the left mouse button and click the right mouse button. Now, select the whole figure, then group them. Remember that grouping isn't the same as welding and it won't destroy our objects. We group figures to move them and edit them together more easily. Grouping will do the same thing in every other graphic program. Now we can do two things. First one is to move or copy our object outside the document's page. Once we do that, a light bulb will be available also on page 1. Switch to page 1 now and downscale the light bulb. The objects are grouped so we don't have to select them one by one to edit their size. Now we can move the light bulb here. Our project is finished. Before we end, select the light bulb and delete it. Now go to page 2 and move the light bulb group outside the document area. It can't overlap with the document's page. If this happens, the figure will be locked on page 2. Another way to move the figure to page 1 is to copy it. To do that, select the figure, press Ctrl C and switch to page 1. Press Ctrl V Now we can downscale and position the light bulb. Press Ctrl S to save our document.